Is it clear? Okay. So welcome to our second session of presentation we call Dharma Talk. So I don't know, does anyone out there have a bell? Okay, Orla, great. Maybe we can start with 3 sounds of the bell. Let's come back to our body, just really fully establish ourselves in this present moment. This is the only moment we have. And so we don't want to waste it thinking about the future or the past. We want to honor the legendary quality of this moment by fully being present for it and for each other. Yeah. So dear friends, it's a wonder that happiness is possible. And I try to wake up every morning and remind myself the wonder it is to be alive, to be experiencing this present moment together as humanity on this beautiful planet Earth. More than, I think, what are we, more than 7 billion now? 8 billion something. And we are participating in this collective consciousness. And we know that if we take care of our mind, we can truly be happy. That's the thing that really woke me up to this practice. And I realized that I could generate joy, I could generate happiness in myself. And that can be a conscious decision that we make, that we can nourish that the kinds of actions in our body, in our speech, in our thinking that bring about more and more happiness. And to bring that to the classroom is so essential. It seems like the missing element of 20th century education, in my opinion, that happiness is possible and that there is a path of happiness. And so our teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, has spent his whole life trying to practice it himself and transmit that to others. And so if we want to know what is the core of Wake Up Schools, that is it. So whenever we get a bit lost, when we wonder, what are we doing? What is this movement about? What is the movement to bring Plum Village teachings into schools? It is that we realize in our own life that happiness is possible and that there is a path of happiness. So that's what I want to focus on today, and how we can find ways in our own practice and in the life of our family, our friends, and our school community to make it easier for those around us and for ourselves to cultivate that path. And that's what our teacher called applied ethics. So some of us went to the presentation yesterday. I think just a few of us in the Americas. Thay Phap Luu gave about the origins of the Wake Up Schools movement. Thay started talking about applied ethics in around 2008, 2007. I think the first time I remember hearing it was 2007. It was after a trip that our teacher made in Vietnam. And applied ethics means that we learn, we recognize that our actions have real effects in the world. And so if we act with a mind full of anger or hatred, then that hatred and anger will go out into the world. And if we act with a mind of love, of caring, of compassion, that love and caring and compassion will go out into the world. So it's a pretty simple principle, applied ethics. And it turns out that there are guidelines, because our mind can be quite tricky and we don't know always what our motivations are. We're doing things, we are kind of reaching out into the world. I just wanted, sorry, I wanted to ask before, is if whoever's host is possible, if it's okay if we didn't chat during the Dhamma talk, so we can really be concentrated. And I don't know if we can turn it off just for this session. I know there's other times we reach out, but it'd be very helpful. So applied ethics is really, okay, how do we walk this path of happiness? And so our teacher Thay looked into what we call what in the Buddhist tradition is called the 5 precepts. But in Plum Village, he gave it a new name, which is the 5 mindfulness trainings. And these were ways of acting, kind of guidelines for our, recognizing that we are not individuals living in isolation. We are living always embedded in community. Even if we are living in a mountain by ourselves for 3 years without talking to anyone, we're still in community. We're still in relationship to others. And so the 5 mindfulness trainings are a skillful way when we don't always see what are, that, oh, I didn't realize when I said that thing, that I was actually deep down, I was angry and I hurt that person. Or sometimes we feel a lot of joy but because of our habit of speech, we say something and it causes somebody to hurt, and it's not our intention, but that's what happens. That person really experiences hurt. And whether we think it's right or wrong, they misunderstood us or not, they still experienced that. That's something that I try to honor now much more in my practice. I used to think, well, that's not my intention. So if you feel hurt, it's not my fault. I don't, but I'm partially responsible for that. And I need to recognize that person had a real painful experience, and they, whether right or wrongly or partially or not, they base that experience, or they see that what I said or did is some cause to that experience. So applied ethics is recognizing that in a very practical way and seeing that we have real effects on the world in the way that we act. And so we can have some guidelines for the way that we live our life. And so the 5 mindfulness trainings are those guidelines, and they are not fixed in stone. They're something that we are always developing. We're always finding new ways that we can express these guidelines. In the original form, they were just not killing, not stealing, not engaging in sexual misconduct, not lying, and not getting intoxicated. But Thay, our teacher, in looking deeply into those precepts, he saw that each one of these actions leads to suffering. And so it's not just a rule that we just blindly follow, but we need to be aware of the suffering that's caused when we kill, aware of the suffering that's caused when we steal and so forth, and we sleep with someone else's committed partner or whatever it might be. So the 5 mindfulness trainings are a kind of guideline, and that is really the core of what Thay called applied ethics. It means that we don't just talk about theoretical ideas about how we do it, but we need to apply it in our life and see what is the result. How do we feel? It can be an experiment to a scientist with our own mind. So we don't have to just accept it on faith, but we put it into practice and we see, oh gosh, when I not necessarily just, I mean, most of us are not going to kill somebody in our lifetime. Hopefully nobody here will do that. But there is killing in the way that we live, right? In the way that we eat, maybe in the way that when we go out and we take care of our yard, or there are insects in our house. And not only killing living beings, but also there's killing in the sense of our thinking, right? Sometimes we just want to, cut somebody off from our life. And in a way, we kill them in our mind. And so it's like they can be standing there right next to us, but we don't even acknowledge their presence. And that is a subtle form of violence. So there are explicit ways of killing, but there are also all these other ways in which we can cause violence towards others. And then there's the awareness that in the collective, the manifestation at the collective level of our consciousness as human beings, there are corporations which are contributing to pollution, to the climate crisis. And in our way of buying products, we support those corporations. And so we try to look and we see in what way can we reduce violence by our way of consumption. And so that is how the first training of not killing is connected to the fifth training of consumption. And so the 5 mindfulness trainings are now formulated in a way aware of the suffering brought about by killing. I am determined not to kill, not to let others kill, and not to support any act of killing in my thinking, in my way of life, for example. And the second, aware of the suffering brought about by social injustice and stealing. I am determined not to respect the property of others, and so forth. And then the same with the third, aware of the suffering brought about by sexual misconduct or rupturing the committed relationships of myself and others. I am committed to to establishing clear boundaries in my relationships, and let that be known to others, so that there is a framework for me in which to practice with that very strong energy of sexual desire. And the same for lying and for consumption. We're always brought back to this point of awareness of suffering, because suffering and happiness are of the same nature. And so when we suffer, we don't have to just despair and think, where is my happiness? It is much closer than we know. That's something that I often practice, and I've really practiced it in the past few days. I think many of us are aware of the invasion of Ukraine, and embracing the difficult emotions that come when we know so many people are dying, are being hurt for very ignorant reasons. And we know that I'm very aware that many of these Russian soldiers, if they are in a karaoke bar with many of the Ukrainian soldiers they're fighting against, they would be singing and laughing together. I have no doubt about that. But because of this ignorance and structures of power that we've created, and it's not somebody else who's done it, it's human beings who've done it, our collective consciousness. When we don't take care of our emotions, take care of our hurt feelings, this is the kind of structures of power that we create as human beings. And then they lead to this destruction. So aware of that, I've been taking care of my emotions, noticing when despair is coming up in me, and knowing that I know that happiness is not far away. We think that happiness is the farthest thing away when we have a feeling of despair. But if we bring mindfulness to that sadness, that that kind of feeling of foiled expectation that humanity is better than this, if we really just shine the light of mindfulness, that same awareness that we brought to our breathing this morning in the guided meditation, something very interesting happens, especially as we practice longer, and that energy of mindfulness becomes stronger. We're not so easily distracted. We're not so easily carried away anymore by that feeling of despair. We don't continue to follow with awareness the lines of thinking, the patterns of thinking that nourish that feeling of despair or sadness, because we recognize that it's only a feeling. And when we're mindful of it, we see in what ways we've been nourishing in our daily life that feeling of sadness or despair. It may be in our judgmentalness towards ourselves and others, or critical, comparing mind is another one. We see ourselves and you think, me, I'm here, I'm doing this, and oh, that other person, they're doing so much better. Their life is so much more fulfilled than me. And that kind of thinking is coming up very often if we're not mindful, and that nourishes that despair. So when we hear about the war or the invasion of the Ukraine, we are touching not only despair because of the situation, but we're also touching a despair that has been nourished in these small ways throughout our daily life. And that is applied ethics. It's applying the practice in every moment and seeing that these things are not disconnected, but that our emotions in our relationships to our partner, to our family, to our colleagues throughout the day is nourishing those same seeds of sadness or anger or jealousy or whatever it might be inside of us. And so then when something happens at the world scale and we read the news, then we feel overwhelmed. And that's what I've been practicing with, to bring mindfulness to that feeling and see, I see how I've been nourishing that. And then noticing that actually there's joy that appears in that, because you get the insight. How is this happening? When we suffer and feel despair and sadness because we don't understand our mind. We feel like it comes from nowhere and it overwhelms us. There's almost nothing we feel we can do. We feel like we are a victim of our despair, of our sadness. But all we need to do is just take a moment and come back to the breathing, or go and sit with a friend face to face, physically in person, and just smile, just have a joyful moment, do something kind to that person. If we feel like we can't do something kind to ourselves, and we should feel we can do something kind for ourselves. It's very important to feel that we can be kind to ourselves. Well, we can do something kind for others. There's always somebody that we feel some feeling of love for, some feeling of care, and we can do something kind for that person. And right away that despair can transform a little bit. There's a light that shines through and joy appears, happiness. So yesterday I was feeling I was reading the news a little bit and just feeling very much for the pain and suffering of people in Ukraine, and everyone, actually, even the Russian soldiers, everyone involved with this suffering. And I recognized, I need to go sit with my brother. So I went over to Thay Phap Luu's room, and then we sat and we had some kombucha, and we just shared together. And right away I felt, this is it. We need to connect as human beings. If we're all just isolated and just reading this kind of horror story, as we maybe want to do, then we can be unaware of how we're watering the seeds of despair in our consciousness. And that's not really helpful for us, and it's not helpful for others. We just feel helpless. But as soon as we connect, as soon as we recognize how we're nourishing that feeling, the situation transforms, and then happiness suddenly becomes possible. Maybe we can listen to a sound of the bell. So after a, a teachers educators retreat in Barcelona in 2014 with our teacher, we had after the big retreat with Thay, we had a smaller retreat with a number of teachers that went on during a week after. And during that time, we sat together and we formulated these, what we call the 3 pillars of Wake Up Schools. And these are reminders for us to what is really the foundation of our practice. So the foundation is happiness is possible. And that by coming back to the present moment, nourishing our happiness, we can go on the path of happiness. And together with we can do that together with our colleagues, our partner, our students, and so forth. And that is something that is essential for education. So that's the fundamental part. And these 3 pillars are just ways of articulating that. And so the first pillar is embodiment. So we practice first to embody the practice of mindfulness. It is not just a tool. So we noticed how because of our collective consciousness, we tend to look for things like tools and we want to realize this objective, and we just need the tool in order to, as an instrument to realize the objective. And so as mindfulness has come into the mainstream, there's a tendency to treat mindfulness as a tool. Like, I need to teach my math lesson. I need to get my students to get up to this standard in exams. I want to have lots of students who get into elite schools, whatever it might be. Or we might be working with kindergartners and we just want them to be quiet, right? Whatever our objective might be, we want to then take mindfulness as a tool and use it to kind of like a bulldozer to kind of do the heavy lifting for us. And then we just kind of stand back, we just make sure that the tool is functioning properly. So this is what we call wrong understanding of mindfulness. And in June of 2014, right after that tour in Spain, I gave a very powerful talk. Mindfulness is a path, not a tool. And I very much encourage you, maybe we can make the transcript of that talk available in the retreat. It's very important, this point. It seems like a subtle point, but it's very important. And that's why our approach in Wake Up Schools has always been to start with the teacher. We need to embody the practice of mindfulness ourselves as teachers. That is the priority. Mindfulness are not just a bunch of techniques which we can kind of affix to the rest of our kind of arsenal of techniques as teachers, and then to wield in appropriate situations. If we don't embody mindfulness, then we're not really on the path. We're trying to get something else, right? It means that mindfulness is something that in itself is fulfilling. So when we talk about a path of happiness, we don't talk about happiness being something as an objective, let alone wealth, fame, power, sex, these other things, right? Those are the normal things that human beings tend to put as objectives. But we can also put happiness as an objective. We put it out there and we think, if I only practice exactly what Brother Phap Luu is saying, and I just commit myself wholeheartedly to it, then someday I'll be happy. And so we kind of grit our teeth and we furrow our brow and we kind of get down to the work of becoming happy. And in the meantime, we're not happy at all. So actually we miss the point entirely. It's very humorous. I laugh, but it's because I have experience of it. When I first started meditating, I treated it as a kind of spiritual athleticism. And I would go on intensive sitting retreats, and I would sit for sometimes 9 hours a day, and until I feel like my knees were going to fall off because there was so much pain. And even if I was allowed to kind of bow and stand up, and it was in a different tradition than this, I wouldn't do it because I would just kind of grip my teeth. And it's like, no, I'm gonna break through my suffering. And meanwhile, I caused my body a lot of pain, and luckily I didn't permanently damage my knees or my legs. But I've heard of people who had to go to the hospital because they took a similar approach. I was an athlete in high school and university, and so it was very natural for me to take that same approach. Like, okay, I get it. I get what the Buddha says. There is suffering. Okay, now I just want to pierce through the veil, this fog of my suffering with my practice, and then I'll come out and everything will be like a pure land, and there'll be unending happiness. But somehow that didn't happen. There were moments of like breakthroughs, but they were ephemeral. And then all that habit was still there in my body. And so then what? Right? Then we have to reassess. And I had to reassess and see, well, maybe, how, in what way I didn't, now I put it into words that I couldn't express, but at that point, but I now see that I was instrumentalizing the Dharma. I was instrumentalizing the practice. I was making a tool out of my own body and mind, in a sense, and not honoring and respecting the wonder of the present moment, the wonder it is to be alive, that's already enough. And that the litmus test of a true right practice is that we feel joy and happiness right there in the present moment. So we should, so it's actually a kind of way of thinking, a habitual way of thinking that we may have been, we have been conditioned to which is to kind of bear up in the midst of like make sacrifice, like bear our cross, as it were, right, in order to arrive at the beatific heaven, whatever it might be. And so this kind of pattern in the collective consciousness is very strong. It's very strong. And wars that are like the invasion of Ukraine that's happening right now are a manifestation of that pattern of thinking. We need to kill in order to have peace, right? That is instrumentalizing war, right? Or everybody wants peace, but we have to bring about a genocide, for example, to have that peace. And that's the kind of thinking that creates so much suffering in the world. So it turns out that we don't have to just be a victim of that collective consciousness, that as practitioners, especially going together, we can help each other to notice when we are doing that, when we want to, for example, pick up the bell when the kids in our classroom are making too much noise, and just like make a loud noise, get everyone to shut up. There's that tendency, right? Like, when I was in music class in elementary school, our teacher, she would sometimes, she would always be at the piano and she would play some songs and we would sing along. But when we were making too much noise and she couldn't get us to quiet down, she would just like lay her both forearms on all the keys of the piano and just go, rah! And it made so much noise that we, all the kids are, oh, she wants us to be quiet. And so sometimes I've noticed that if we're not trained properly in how to use the bell and see the bell as a friend, then we can use it as a tool to make, because there's a habit of being quiet when we invite the bell. So we invite it. Okay, everyone, shut up. And we actually create a bad habit in the consciousness of the collective consciousness of our classroom. And this has happened with the monastics too. If you've ever been to Plum Village, after a Dhamma talk, sometimes when I think when Thay was there, we were a little bit more careful. And Thay was quite strict when we'd go into the meditation hall for a talk. Then there should be silence as we gather and sit down. And then after the Dhamma talk, it should also be silent and we should go out quietly. But over time, after Thay would go out, then the monastics, we would start to have conversations and it would become quite loud. And then one of the monks or nuns would come up to the big bell in the hall and we suddenly hear donk, very loud noise. And you felt the irritation of that monk or nun. Usually they were the ones who had to clean up the meditation hall, put the mats and cushions back afterwards. And everyone felt like, oh, uh-oh, she's not happy with us. That's what goes through everybody's mind. They think, oh, uh-oh. And so we have that tendency as well in each one of us, right? We just want quiet, we want peace. If we're on a retreat like this, probably we enjoy the quiet, we enjoy peace. And as meditators, that can be our biggest trap, is to think that we need to create an atmosphere of quiet and peace around us in order for us to be happy. We can become the worst kind of dictators because of that wanting to establish peace and quiet in the classroom. And so something I've learned living in community is that even when it's very noisy, there can be a joyfulness, there can be a lightness, and I can try to connect with that lightness and joy and move with it and flow with it. And that is also mindfulness. So noisiness, quiet, neither one is more mindful than the other necessarily by default, but it's actually what is can we get in touch with what is under there? Is there joy? Is there there could be some excitement, but we want to not become obstructive in our way of living or teaching. And so this is all in the space of embodiment. So when we invite the bell, and it is coming from we prepare our mind first. In Plum Village, Thay offered us a gatha, gatha means a kind of short poem that helps us prepare our mind for inviting the bell. So it goes like this: body, speech, and mind in perfect oneness. I send my heart along with the sound of this bell. May those who hear it awaken from forgetfulness and transcend the path of anxiety and sorrow. It's very beautiful. Body, speech, and mind in perfect oneness. So it means that I'm concentrated when I invite the bell. I know I'm inviting the bell when I invite the bell. And we do it with two hands, right? We hold the bell in one hand and then the stick, which we call an inviter, in the other. Or if we have a big bell, then we might have just one hand on the inviter, but we're fully present for inviting the bell. We're not lost in conversation or distracted in our thinking. So that's what body, speech, and mind in perfect oneness means. It means the three kind of actions that go out into the world, actions of our body, our speech, our thinking, they are in one. They are not dissociated from one another. They're rooted in. We know that we talk about three kinds of actions, but actually they're all rooted in our mind, right? So that's the insight the Buddha had. So actions of body and speech, they're rooted in our mind. So we need to establish ourselves fully in the present moment before we invite the sound of the bell. So body, speech, and mind in perfect oneness. I send my heart along with the sound of this bell. May those who hear, I send my heart along with the sound of this bell. So it means that with the sound of this bell, I am sending out to all the children, to all of my students, to my colleagues, what is in my heart. So if there's irritation, if there's judgment, I will send that out with the sound of the bell. And if there's joy, if there's peace, if there's happiness, then I will send that along with the sound of the bell. And it's not just about the bell, right? It's about everything we do. So the bell is a kind of practicing with the bell is a way of training ourselves to see that if my mind is full of joy and love and peace, that is when I speak, when I act, that is what I will send out to everyone. But if my heart is full of anger, cynicism, jealousy, then when I speak, that will tend to be what I send out to everyone. So it's really about taking care of ourselves and embodying the practice, not just learning a bunch of mindfulness techniques. And then when the going gets tough in the classroom, then opening up the Happy Teachers Change the World book and then to the right page and then just going through the steps. That's kind of training we do for ourselves. But when it comes to the moment where we are sharing, not only when we're sharing, but in everything we do as teachers, it's not about a technique, but it's about a lived embodiment of the practice. And this is, yeah. So that's the first pillar of Wake Up School's embodiment. The second pillar is service. So our teacher in the 60s, along with Sister Shan Kong and others, began a movement in Vietnam after he had studied for a time in the West at Princeton and Columbia. He went back to Vietnam and saw the situation of the American War. What in the US they call it the Vietnam War. And he wanted to help without taking one side or the other. And this has become a profound teaching for all of us in every situation of conflict that we find ourselves in, where we feel like, oh, I'm going to side with this group or that group. Like now is very, we see the situation with Russia and Ukraine, and it can feel easy to want to side with one group. But our practice is to go more deep and see the roots of the conflict that creates these two enemies, so that we can, because our main practice is understanding. We want to understand because understanding makes love possible, and love makes understanding possible. So they are feeding each other, and we know that because we're going for the long run. We're not just going for a immediate resolution. One side wins, the other one loses, right? But we want to get down to the roots, because we see that the roots of the conflict in Ukraine are much deeper than just this past few years, much deeper than these past few decades, much deeper than even just these past centuries. There are deep, deep roots, and we want to understand those roots. And by understanding that, we no longer are caught in one side or the other. So Thay, when he went back to Vietnam, he had to toe a very, very difficult line, as it were, between the communist and the American supported regime in the South. And he created what's called in English, the School of Youth for Social Service, which was a movement to train young people to become teachers and go out into the very rural areas of Vietnam, which had almost no schools, no sanitation, no medical care, just simple farming villages with a screen of bamboo around them, and traditional practices, which are very wonderful. But there's a lot of people dying young, kids not being able to even learn to read. And so Thay wanted to help the situation, and Sister Shan Kong. And so they created this school. And The Miracle of Mindfulness, a book perhaps many of you have read, is actually the manual for those those young teachers. It's a training manual for how to, for example, when you wash the dishes, you only wash the dishes. An entire, it started as a training manual for those teachers, and then Thay developed it over time before it was published in the 70s. But that was the root of that book, is to help those teachers to have a small book that they could carry with them to remind them how to practice when they were trained together in Saigon, but they would go out into usually on their own, to different villages. And their attitude was always one of service. They didn't come with money, or they didn't come trying to make money, right? Or try to make a profit, but they came with the spirit of just connecting, of recognizing their common plight. Even they were educated young people from the city, but they knew that they were not separate from the simple farmers and their children. And over time, they won the trust. They would win the trust of those villagers. And first, one farmer might give their house as a little schoolhouse for during the day when they're out working in the fields, and then the volunteer could have a short, fun classes with the kids. And then with time, the villagers would then see, oh, this is very good for our children. We want to build a school, and they would build a school for them. And then other things could come in, sanitation, like privies and even medical care. And so that is the spirit that infuses every aspect of Wake Up Schools. We do this because of our deep aspiration to want to transform society, to transform the situations of conflict, like the one we're is going on right now in Ukraine. We want to, that is just a gross manifestation of the kind of violence and conflict that I think we all see as teachers, that rooted in our students. We see those tendencies, and we want to embody a kind and walking a path that can serve as a inspiration and a model for our students and colleagues. And so that is the spirit with which we approach it. This is the second pillar, is service. So we don't we're in Wake Up Schools, we're not interested at all in creating a program that will then be like, you can make a profession out of it. And we know that it's wonderful that we need more mindfulness teachers in the world. We're not trying to discourage or even be judgmental towards those who, of course, we all need money to live, but we have to really we come back to that as our core principle, our core aspiration, right? Is not to just make a career for ourselves in teaching mindfulness, but rather so this is why we always focus on teachers of that are already teaching, and not so much on like training people, tooling them up to become mindfulness teachers, but rather like teachers who are already in a situation, already in the classroom. You're in your career as teachers, and then helping you on your path so that you can embody happiness and joy, be happy teachers, and be inspiration to your students. Because if they see you're truly happy, that is you cannot compare that to just learning a technique. Whether the children, whether the colleagues, whether your family, you can talk all you like about mindfulness, but until you really they see your joy, they see your happiness, they'll always just smile and be very nice, maybe polite, but it won't necessarily inspire them to transform their lives. And so that is why we make that as a pillar, this service, because we notice that there can be a tendency, and we've worked with teachers for, I've been a monk for 17 years, and every year I'm doing work with teachers, and so I've seen situations where teachers, they knew mindfulness is good for their kids, but they weren't really fully able to bring it into their own life. And so it wasn't very effective. I mean, the kids were obedient when, in the class, because that's what they're supposed to do, but it didn't have that lasting effect that comes about when you're really doing it, when you're really on the path. And at some point, even perhaps getting to the point where you see your students and you as spiritual friends on the path, rather than you as the authority, the teacher, and them as the ones who's learning. But I know that there are dynamics in the classroom that have to be respected and maintained. But that is really much the spirit, and that is the spirit with which our teacher Thay taught us as well. He really saw himself as a spiritual friend. We honor him as a high, our Thay, our teacher, and we are his disciples. But really, and I know, and he told us and showed in his way of action that he sees himself as a good spiritual friend, and we are all friends on the path. So that is also the in the heart of that second pillar of Wake Up Schools service. It is we are all spiritual friends on the path. We, our colleagues, our students, our family, the school administration, we start to see each other not as like factions or, oh, he's with that one and I'm pushing for this in the school. I'm pushing for mindfulness in the school, and they just want to get like hard test results. And, we create factions in our mind if we're not careful. But if we look more deeply and we see that everyone is on a spiritual path in some sort, even they won't call it that, but we're all in some way, we're listening, we're learning from each other, we're on the path, we're this path of life. And underneath every authoritarian figure, there is a crying boy who is hurt, deceived, maybe betrayed, right, in some way, shape, or form. And so we can get in touch with that. And so then we have compassion, and we can come back and see ourselves as a spiritual friend to that colleague who's so difficult, or that student who just seems to be challenging us all the time. We can touch our seat of compassion, which is vast and wide. Maybe we can listen to another sound of the bell. And the third pillar of Wake Up Schools is community. So I'm looking out on this beautiful grid in front of me, such a beautiful community of teachers. We've been coming together since yesterday, and I know it's sometimes not been easy to connect on Zoom, maybe for all of us, but we're all like, what I feel is that there's all this good intention, this love, and we're all doing our best to create community in this around the world. I live in community day in and day out here at Deer Park, and before in Plum Village, and I recognize as a young man how much I needed community. I look back on this kind of idea of a nuclear family as a kind of a very strange aberration in the history of humanity, that somehow we I think it's really it's almost to create these kind of like units of capital in a sense, for a consumer society, that we somehow ended up in this situation where we're living in these small families, and we actually lose the power of community, of that deep bond of connecting day in and day out, of looking at each other, saying hello, eating together. So important. The word companion means to eat bread with someone, right? And so all of these for tens of thousands of years, this is how we've lived on the planet. And it's only very recently that we've tried this new experiment of dividing ourselves up into little boxes and then more and more, isolating ourselves more and more and more. And so Thai coming to the West, I mean, in Vietnam, I just spent a month in Vietnam. I got back a few days ago, and it's this energy is coming into Vietnam, but in most of Vietnamese culture is very, very communal. In the street, in the everything in the house, it's just this everyone, big families living together, and sense of aunts and uncles. Usually, when you meet somebody in the street, you call them your aunt or your uncle. You don't just say you or call them by a title or something. You know, they're always, the title that you might call them is always in relationship to you. So it's not a title based on like their relationship to an institution, right? But it's you call them in relationship, like you say chi, it means my elder sister, or an, my elder brother, or chu, my elder uncle, or whatever, my uncle, or whatever, go, my aunt. And so that's how you refer to them. They don't use like I and you as pronouns. So so there's very much you're even in the way of speaking in Vietnam, you're establishing relationship, not just of I and you, but like, how do I relate to you? And then that way of referring to you then affects the way, and then we start to develop it. And it's not hard and fixed, those relationships. So it's not stratified, but it's like it's a way of like, okay, now I'm conscious that I'm in my conversation, my way of speaking to you, we're building a relationship based around this. So that person might be my uncle and that other person might be my uncle, but my relationship can be totally different to them. But it's all around building the relationship around, I refer to you as my uncle. Yeah, I call you uncle, you call me nephew, and so forth. And it's extended. It's not just like literal blood uncles, but it can be anyone, really. And so the whole living is communal in that sense. And it's only very recently, in the past 10, 20 years, that this kind of individualism from the West is starting to penetrate. Whereas we're having a crisis, I think, in the West around this. Is this really a good idea? And people are looking at how can we reconnect with community. So Wake Up Schools is that's why we build it into the basis of the foundation of this movement, because we recognize that we cannot do it alone. We need community. And that's not like that's an insight, right? That we get. It's not like we're trying to push in that direction. We really recognize we cannot be by ourselves alone. We can only interbe. And so from that point, it becomes easier to accept, okay, so I need to learn how to develop relationships with my fellow teachers, because that is going to support what I'm doing in the classroom, rather than just think in an antagonistic way. All these people around me, they're just obstacles. They just have to get them out of my way so I can do my real work, which is to teach my students. See, that mentality is already dualistic. It's already creating us, a me, or us and them, right? So we want to kind of massage that way of thinking, so that we get free from what we call a dualistic way of thinking, black and white, up, down, me, you, and so forth, and start to see that we're all in relationship, and that is being mindful of the process and the communication that's going on. So starting with our intention, what is in our heart when we speak, and then knowing that we can then trust. And with training, we can learn skillful speech, what we call loving speech, which goes together with deep listening, like the capacity to really listen when someone speaks to us, opening our heart, letting go of our thinking, our perceptions, so we can get in touch with the situation of suffering. Not just to help them, but also to help ourselves to cultivate compassion. compassion is not just empathy, it's also being able to act to reduce the suffering of another person. And just by really listening deeply, we are able to reduce the other person's suffering. Do not just yeah, underestimate our capacity to help someone suffer less with our compassion and our deep listening. So loving speech becomes more easy and natural the more we are mindful of our relationships and community, because we see how even with good intention we may hurt someone, and we can listen to them so we can understand how to be more skillful in the future, because we don't want to hurt, right? That's our applied ethics again that we started off with the first mindfulness training, not to kill or harm others. So that's very clear. That's in the foundation of our practice. So we looked into the 5 mindfulness trainings and applied ethics, which is a kind of the backbone, I like to say, of wake up schools, but it's also the heart. And then and how that manifests through these 3 pillars of wake up schools: embodiment, taking care of ourselves and our own practice of mindfulness. Mindfulness is a path, not a tool. Service, the second pillar of mindfulness, that we do it, our deep aspiration to transform ourselves and others. That is our primary aspiration. And the third, community, that everything we do as a collective. I used to say one Buddha is not enough. And so one happy teacher is not enough. We need a community of happy teachers. A community of happy teachers change the world. Actually, that's the unwritten part. That's why it says happy teachers change the world. It's not just one happy teacher. It's a community. And so we do it together. And so coming together like this online, building sanghas of practice in our school, building a sangha in our classroom, these are all ways of building community. And when we build a beautiful, beloved community, it's a great source of happiness. And it becomes much easier to take care of our despair. And because we have friends, spiritual friends on the path who can support us. Okay, I think that's enough for this talk. This is so much fun to be together, and I look forward to the next activities that we have. Thank you for listening. We can finish with 3 sounds of the bell. Okay, bye-bye.